Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
John,
Merryn.
it's been a while since we talked. A lot has happened. And I was thinking, what are we going to cover in this tiny little bit that we get to chat before we move on to the interview? What's it going to be? So I've decided it's going to be absolutely everything. And I hope you're down with that decision because we've only got 5 minutes. So here we go. Are you ready?
Good.
Okay, gold. Gold. How do you feel about gold?
Amazing. It's been up like eight days in a row. It's like, wow, this kind of, the gold bugs were right all those decades ago.
That's me, right? So what you're saying is, Merryn, you were right.
Just as with Japan. You just have to be patient.
In the end, wait 20 years, you get there. So new high after new high after new high. It's exciting, but we know it's not up until now, it has not been the Western retail investor, right? It's been the retail investors in China. And in particular, it's been central banks because we've seen outflows from ETFs in the West year after year after year. Flattened out, maybe turning around.
Yeah, the Japanese retail investor as well. I was reading this morning a good piece by Charles Gav's son. Guys, his name escapes me, but is it Gavakal? And he was pointing out that after the last Bank of Japan central bank meeting, where they were much more dovish than expected, activity in the Japanese version of the physical gold ETF just went bananas, as he puts it. And basically, it sounds like the Japanese are fed up with the yen being devalued. And now the Chinese are getting fed up with the yuan being devalued. And so everyone in those countries is basically reacting to what they see as rampant currency debasement by buying gold. So, I mean, it's fascinating.
Okay, so everything that we've been talking about for years is sort of slightly coming to fruition. People are increasingly concerned that inflation is not going away, that the value of the currency is not going to hold, that the dollar is not what it was, that buying US treasuries is not the answer to everything. So I wrote a column about this earlier in the week where I said that effectively gold is the everything hedge for central banks. And if it's good enough for them, do you know what? It's good enough for us. So that's gold. Silver.
Silver's... What is it? Sebastian Lyon always described it as gold on crack. So I think you should take that exactly at face value. Have a play with it if you want to, but be very careful and don't expect too much of it. If it goes up an awful lot, then maybe you should look at taking profits. Definitely a trade rather than a buy and hold, whereas gold is portfolio insurance.
Message from John, don't take too much crack. Thanks, John. Right. What else? The widening out of the US market. So we've had this incredibly intense concentration into the Magnificent Seven. They're not all doing very well anymore. In fact, we're now down to, I think, the Magnificent Three in terms of ones that are doing very well. And actually, someone pointed out to me yesterday that in dollar terms, gold has done better than the Magnificent Seven so far this year. So we're beginning to see the performance of the megatech slide relative to everything else. We're beginning to see a widening out of the market. This seems like a good thing, right? Or does it tell us there's a big crash coming right now?
If I'm honest, I think it's a good thing. I think it boils down to the market coming to terms with the idea that maybe there's not going to be a recession, and also feeling broadly optimistic about the economy's ability to cope with higher interest rates. Maybe a bit of fear of inflation thrown in because you can see the commodities are coming back, and that's partly because China seems to be levelling out, if not bouncing back, and certainly Chinese stocks have rebounded strongly. So overall, I wouldn't say it's something to be worried about, but you may have read something that I haven't.
I'm always worried. If inflation is not defeated, as you and I have been talking about for ages, and we've been talking for ages about higher for longer rather than lower sooner. We've been worried about energy markets. We've been worried about the oil price, in which we may well have been justified. Is there an energy crisis ahead, etc.? We'll come to more of that in a minute. I'm watching the oil price pretty closely. That's always a worry. Yeah. But I'm also looking at the big stocks and thinking, well, hang on, they've definitely gone far enough. This concentration is out of control. So what happens next is there a mini crisis there, or do we get the second order stocks, say the ones that will definitely do very well out of AI but aren't the ones making the chips, etc.? Do we see them coming to the forefront, which is kind of what we saw in the 90s, right? So there's lots of interesting things going on in the markets, which we will keep writing about. But moving on to the next bit, which is the wrappers inside which you keep those investments. You've written about ISAs. We love ISAs. We don't like to see interference in ISAs. You're a bit worried about that. New ISA season just beginning, by the way. Get that 20 grand in.
The problem is, so it's a kind of leftish think tank. The Resolution Foundation came out with a bit of an attack on ISAs, saying that essentially the tax breaks are too generous. So because not everyone can put 20 grand a year in an ISA, and I do sympathise, the suggestion is that, well, it's all of this tax relief, if you like, is being weighted towards the wealthiest in society, blah, blah, blah. So we should cap the overall amount you can stick in an ISA the same way that they had a cap on the pension, the lifetime allowance, to £100,000.
Well.
Exactly. And I mean, it's a typical economist argument where they frame it in kind of number terms, but really it just boils down to your political viewpoint. And they don't think about what the knock-on problem will be. That as soon as you start messing around with ISAs, you get to the same problem we've got with pensions, which is that they are mercilessly messed around with by governments on a kind of semi-annual basis. And that's one good reason why people don't trust them. And if you do the same with ISAs, then you're just putting a big target under the side of them for all future chancellors to either raid or mess about with. And it really would be a extremely damaging thing to do to what is a popular and still relatively simple savings product. So I just think it's a bad idea. And at the same time, I'm worried that it's the direction of travel because, we are getting a Labour government most likely, in the next 6 months.
A Labour government that has started talking about tax dodging rather than dividing things up between evasion and avoidance, which is so important. And what is legal, what isn't legal. No one can be criticised for tax avoidance. They can definitely be criticised for tax evasion, which brings us, of course, to poor Angela Rayner very briefly. I don't need to talk about the issues around whether she did or didn't or should have or shouldn't, because we have no idea. But what it does show up is the extraordinary complication of the UK tax system. And this is the bit that I'm looking at and going, well, hang on, So what someone like Angela Rayner had to do when living in a house with one person, or not living in a house with one person, I don't know, but married, if you're married, you can only have one principal home for tax purposes. How do you even know that? How are people supposed to know that? And how are they supposed to choose which one it is? How are they supposed to understand the nomination process? All these things are impossibly complicated and difficult. And then you find you do have to pay capital gains on one house because you didn't nominate it or because you live somewhere else or whatever it is. And then there are a million allowances that you can claim against that. So what might look like a 28% tax bill of £10,000+ can be brought down to zero in the blink of an eye with exemptions and exceptions, etc. And so if I were in government, which is never going to happen, because my Twitter account, I'm sure, would never allow it. If I were to be in government, the first thing I would do is say, hang on, the lesson we could learn here as a new government is that this system is out of control, complicated. Let's go, simple, low, and unavoidable. I've got a column coming out on why that means it's time. It really is time, and I'm sure at this point Angela Rayner would agree, it really is time for a low, flat rate of capital gains tax on all property sales in the UK to be brought in hand with the full abolition of stamp duty. Just agree with me, John. You know you want to.
Wait, are you talking about all home sales? Even my family home?
Yes, your family home. And you know, while I'm at it, I might withdraw that IHT exemption on your family home.
What? Merryn, it's like bombshell
and then you know what I want you to do? Stop treating that house as though it's the greatest investment in the world because you don't have to pay any tax on it. It's not an investment. It's your home. Put your investment money somewhere else. That's all I want from you, John.
I think you should stand for Prime Minister. So I entirely agree with this. Just in case anyone thought I wasn't joking. It's a great idea.
Low, simple, unavoidable. Let's do it. Talking to you, Keir Starmer. Talking to you, Angela Rayner. Do you think they're listening?
Yes, of course. Of course.
Okay, excellent. So, John, for our first week back from our holidays, we've had this wonderful quickfire round. I know everybody's enjoyed it. We didn't get anywhere near the tax gap. I'm leaving that for next week. Actually, no, John's going to write a column about tax gap, aren't you? Or am I? One of us is going to. We'll get to that. One of us will. Anyway, first week back, we're actually, unusually, we are discussing a book by a colleague of ours. So no one from the outside this time. We're all inside this week. Akshat Rathi, he's a senior reporter on the team covering climate issues, and he hosts his own podcast, Zero, which obviously you should listen to. He's written a book called Climate Capitalism, Winning the Global Race to Zero Emissions. Now, John, the bit I like about this, and I know you've read the transcript, is that it's called climate capitalism, not climate destroy capitalism. That works for me.
Yeah, it's reassuring. As soon as I hear the word climate, there's a little bit of me that kind of dies inside usually, but it's no, I mean, it clearly dies due to the uncontrolled effects of global warming. But other than that, it's but no, I think when you see it combined with capitalism, it's like we're starting to talk about this stuff like adults. So that's good.
Yep. And it takes us away from the whole, in order to deal with climate change, we need to absolutely destroy the system that created it.
Yes.
Because, you can either say, well, that's just ridiculous because this is the only system that works, or you can say there isn't time for it anyway. Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb. Here's my conversation with Bloomberg senior reporter Akshat Rathi. Before Bloomberg, Akshat worked for Quartz and The Economist, and his work has been cited in widely read global publications, including The New York Times, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, and The Financial Times. That's pretty much everything. Akshat and I discussed the main thesis behind his book, Climate Capitalism. So here we go. So thank you very much for your book. I've enjoyed reading it enormously, and I wanted to start with the big picture stuff, which is how you really feel about capitalism. In that when someone picks up your book, they go straight in, they're going to start at the introduction, and the first couple of pages, they're going to hear a lot about the extractive economic system built up to maximize profits, concentrate wealth in the hands of the rich. They're going to go on to unfettered capitalism and some discussion about the conceivable possibility of overthrowing capitalism, etc. By the time they get to page 3, they're going to think that this is going to be a book about overthrowing capitalism, changing the world completely, and introducing a different system, which of course we know never works. But that's not for this podcast. That's for another time. But of course, as we go through the book, that's not really how you feel, is it? So let's talk about your sort of slightly conflicted feelings around what capitalism represents.
In a way, the conflicted feeling of capitalism is what I observe in the audience, right? There is all the evils are sometimes put into this basket of capitalism and very rarely defined what it is. But I also wanted to start this book by taking the view that environmentalists have taken, which is that there is just no way to solve the climate problem without overthrowing capitalism. And they never offer an alternative that actually works. And so, by page 3, you also get Noam Chomsky, the famous anti-capitalist, who tells you, well, if this is to be solved on a deadline, there is no way to overthrow capitalism. You just have to modify it to make it work. And my reporting shows that around the world, in countries of all types of economic and political contexts, in all types of affordability, from developing countries like India to rich countries like the US, there are tweaks being made to the market system so that it can start to finally address the climate challenge in a scale that is necessary.
Okay, but the key thing here is that capitalism is the solution to climate change, in that there is only one system that we know has worked long term to pull people out of poverty. You write about this yourself, about the way in the combination of capitalism and fossil fuels has been the most extraordinary game changer for humanity in terms of making us rich, making us prosperous, pulling people out of poverty. And so the best thing for us to do from here is to say, hey, this is really something, and we should use the power of this to pull ourselves out of the hole we've dug ourselves into.
We don't have a better system to try and find the signal in the noise around the world, right? Markets provide this really good sorting mechanism of connecting the buyers with the sellers at ideally the right price. But what has happened is that in this process, we have, as an economic system, ignored the costs of the pollution. And that is now being incorporated into the economic system. And I think that's what's changing climate capitalism to
Yeah.
work.
So what we're doing here is we're recognizing that occasionally the market doesn't include everything in the price, and we have to give it a nudge to get the last bit in the price.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So then can we just talk before we go on to talking about the wonderful stories in the book? Because I'm thrilled by your book, because John and I always talk about how we expect human ingenuity to solve all the problems. And, there's so much doom and gloom, endless doom and gloom. But in the end, so far, human ingenuity has always solved most of the problems. But this is a slightly bigger problem than most, right? In that moving to anything close to net zero involved the kind of transformation of global economics, global systems, global living standards that has really never happened before, particularly given the size of the global population now. So when we look back at previous transformations, say into fossil fuels, etc., populations have been much smaller, systems have been much smaller. It's a very different thing to changing an energy system that drives a population of say 8 billion people. So it's a huge thing. So even with all the sort of rather exciting things that you write about in the book, I wanted to get a sense here of what you believe is actually possible within, say, the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, it's a very good question, because previous transformations, say going from wood to coal or from coal to oil as the major source of energy, have happened over timelines that were driven by the economics rather than a deadline given to you by scientists, right? That is the net zero framework we have, that until we reach zero emissions, we keep warming the planet up and extreme weather events keep increasing. Now, what is possible? Theoretically, net zero by 2050 is possible. And I say theoretically because there is a plan. It's been put forward by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that is being signed off by 195 countries to deliver on that goal. So it's certainly doable. Now, what is practical is a different question, because
Let me stop you there then. When you say it's doable, what would be the consequences of doing it inside that time frame to that plan? Because we'll move on to the extent that whether it's practical or not. But when you say it's doable, what do you mean?
So to think about the net zero challenge, it helps to perhaps split it into 4 parts, 4 pieces of the pie, say. A quarter is electricity, a quarter is transport, a quarter is industry, and a quarter is agriculture. And what we now have is solutions for at least half of them, which is how to get electricity sector to zero emissions using solar, wind, batteries, geothermal, hydropower, a combination of large transmission across huge amounts of distances. In transportation, again, through electric cars, through lithium-ion batteries, through new modes of transport that are coming through in aviation and shipping, there is a plan to get to zero emissions. Industrial sector, we are at a younger stage in those technologies, but those technologies are starting to become commercial. So either you apply carbon capture, which is an ability to take the emissions from the smokestacks of industry, put it deep underground, or you move to hydrogen, which is happening in Sweden, converting steel production from using coal to hydrogen, or use electricity to be able to convert iron ore to iron, which is also starting to happen. That's the industrial pie. And then agriculture is actually fascinating, because there are big challenges in that there are hundreds of millions of farmers who need to be able to adopt these solutions. But if you do adopt those solutions, you actually start to use agriculture to store carbon into the ground rather than be a producer of emissions. And so that's what I say, that this plan exists, that there are technologies that are there, and slowly the economic systems are also being put to make these technologies be deployed.
Okay, can I skip you quickly back to agriculture, because on the previous 3 you explained what you meant, but what are the systems in agriculture you're talking about? We've done a podcast before on pasture-led farming and that kind of thing, and sequestration in the soil. Is that what you mean, or is there something else?
So agricultural emissions are split into perhaps two big gases. One is carbon dioxide that has come from losing carbon from the soil. And the second is nitrogen emissions that come from using fertilizers that are made synthetically, right? We create ammonia from natural gas right now. So moving to ammonia that's made from hydrogen that is produced from green electricity is now possible. It is slightly expensive, but you start to make it cheaper. You start to reduce the emissions that come from ammonia production. But you'd still have nitrogen emissions that are generated in the soil. Those need to be managed by a counterbalancing force, which is you start to absorb CO2 rather than produce. And so what's happening on CO2 specifically on agriculture is there are methods called regenerative agriculture, where you can actually increase the yield of a farm while increasing the amount of CO2 that is absorbed by those soils. It's just a new way of thinking about how to do this, not to say it's never been done in the past. Lots of people around the world, indigenous communities, have mastered these ideas, but we've moved to an industrial structure where it has been much more extractive and not thinking about the regenerative aspect as much. It just requires a change in thinking.
Yeah, it seems ambition is good, but it seems an extraordinary ambition that you could achieve that across the global agricultural sector in a couple of decades.
Correct.
And when I look at the numbers, I mean, obviously what's absolutely crucial is to remind everybody that net zero is not zero. Right? Because when you speak to people about net zero, sometimes there is a sort of odd assumption that it means that by net zero means that we don't use fossil fuels at all. And of course, it means absolutely nothing of the sort. It means that we work to get ourselves to a net level of zero. But when you look at the numbers for the last 20 years or so, and you see that we've worked so hard on, for example, renewables, wind, solar, biofuels, etc., and we've increased our use of them by 50, 60 times, but we are still over 80% dependent on fossil fuels. So whenever we talk about all these wonderful optimistic things, but then when we look at the raw data, it's hard to see progress because of the rising demand for energy.
Yes, it is. And let me give you the practical side of it in two forms. One, the challenge is actually not as big as 80%. And I'll tell you why. Because most of the fossil fuels that are burned today in cars, in factories, in power plants are wasted. And when I say wasted, the heat that is produced that is actually converted into useful work is a tiny fraction. In a car, it's like 25%. In a power plant, it's usually 40%. And so when you move to an electrical system, it is just a ton more efficient. So for the same unit of energy in an electric car, you can go 4 times the distance as you would in a fossil fuel car. So you don't need to replace a system that is, say, 100 units of energy today with 100 units of energy in a net zero system. You actually need to do only 60 units maybe. So that's one. But the second side is absolutely right. The practicality of how quickly we change the system is really hard. And there are, again, two sides to think about. This has always been the challenge, right? Moving to a renewable system that would have even 10 or 20 or 30% on the grid was thought to be impossible. There will be blackouts. Well, we are now at 60, 70% in some countries in Europe on an annual basis. And those blackout fears haven't come true. So there's the reality of actually.
But that's because we still have the backup systems in place. We still have the, we've dealt with the intermittency by still having gas and coal, et cetera, in place.
Correct. Yes,
and if there's a push to not recognize intermittency, that's where you run into trouble. And of course, our grids are increasingly old and creaky, and we can't really, certainly in the UK, we can't really put out much more in the way of renewable. We can't connect much more without revamping the grid, right? So we've got to a certain point, and we're very reliant on our backup systems, and we're very reliant on a crumbling grid. So I've interrupted you, I'm sorry, but I sort of slightly feel we've got as far as we can go without really doing some very significant building and without recognizing the problem of intermittency slightly more than we have so far. Is that wrong?
Oh, for sure. I think you're absolutely right. We have done a significant amount of building, just deploying renewable assets here in the UK, say offshore wind. But the interconnections need to come through. The technologies to store energy need to come through. But again, this challenge is a global challenge. So if the UK and Denmark are places where you get 50, 60, 70% renewable electricity, you can make that happen in India, which currently gets less than 10% from solar and wind, right? So India has a huge way to go. And so you can start to see how this comes in place. But going back to the practicality, 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, these are the two goals set in the Paris Agreement. The likelihood of us meeting 1.5 is becoming vanishingly small. But the likelihood of actually reaching 2 is still very much possible. And so you may not get the perfect outcome of net zero by 2050, but you might get net zero by 2070, which is still so much better than the world we are headed towards right now, which is 3 degrees Celsius of warming.
Okay. All right. So in practical terms, it's just going to take longer, be more difficult than the big optimists think, but it's still possible within a slightly longer time frame. And of course, we have no idea what happens next. We're incredibly bad at predicting the future, aren't we? I mean, as humans, we're really lousy at this. We think things are going in one direction, and mostly they're not. We think something's going to change the world. We find we've gone in slightly the wrong direction. We think we've got everything under control, and then we have a pandemic and find we don't know how to make masks. We're very bad at this. So all sorts of things could happen in the intervening period that show us that we're right or wrong. We've got a red herring here, a red herring there, or gone down the wrong road with some kind of electric car or something like that. But in the round, you think that we are on the correct track.
Yes, we are bad at predicting the future. And that's why I think the capitalistic system is actually the better one to rely on. Because instead of a government choosing a technology to back to get us to the answer that we think we have, it is so much better to have governments support a bunch of bets through market direction that we need to get to a decarbonized grid, but don't pick a particular winner. They allow the market to have these signals and noise to come through and show us which one works, because the solution for a particular place may be different. The UK has offshore wind. India may not have so much offshore wind, but it has a ton of solar.
Yeah,
so
it could have amazing solar, and at least they'll know they get proper sun.
Yes, exactly. And so you allow for markets to participate in a solution that they are well capable of delivering on.
Okay, so which country do you think is doing the best job of nudging prices to make this work?
So climate capitalism sort of shows that this can happen in different contexts. Let's take 3 examples. The US is doing it through the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, it's the last one to come to the party. The US has dragged its feet on trying to do much on decarbonization. You can blame the politics. You can blame other factors like it's become a fossil fuel giant. But now it is at the party, at least under this presidency. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in 2022, was passed despite the political divide between the Democrats and Republicans on climate. And the likelihood of it lasting, regardless of where the politics goes this year when the election happens, is quite high because of the way it was structured. In this American system, it's all about tax credits. It's all about giving benefit to companies building clean energy technologies. That's not the system Europe has adopted. Europe has the Green Deal, which was signed over the last few years, and it is very much a carrot and stick model, and the stick is typically bigger. And that's to do with European countries not having quite the capacity to spend like America does, but also because of the European system where the European Union has only so much power. All the countries within it have to do the rest. And then you have the Chinese system, which is state-driven capitalism.
Should actually, I should just interrupt you to say that despite all that, good news coming out of the US, its oil production is still at a record high, isn't it?
Very much. So not just oil production, gas production is a record high too. And, we live in this 2-track world where, climate impacts will keep getting worse as we extract more fossil fuels and put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but also because of the urgency of the problem and because many of these technologies are actually just cheaper, you're getting an acceleration of the solutions that are being deployed. And so, the Chinese version has not been so much driven by the emissions or by trying to meet climate goals. It's been driven by trying to create domestic industries, to create export industries, and grow its economy. It did that with solar and wind, and then it did it with batteries and electric cars, and now it's starting to get into hydrogen. And so, because of its state-driven capitalism and its sort of political nature where a leader stays in power for decades, it has had that ability to work on that problem for a long time, and that's starting to give dividends for that country and for the world because those technologies have become cheaper as a result.
It's interesting, though. I mean, China remains the biggest polluter. It continues to burn what percentage of the planet's coal? I mean, I don't know, 50%, something like that, and continues to put up new coal plants at the same time as doing all this. So obviously, unlike other countries, there isn't a feeling behind the Chinese shift of we want to save the world. The shift is we want to create new industries and control those industries and flog them to the rest of the world. It's a slightly different dynamic, actually a very different dynamic.
Yes, I mean, that is the primary driver. But it is also true that China recognizes the challenge because China is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. So in this period where you had tensions between US and China grow, and they still remain, the one thing that through that tense period they continued to collaborate on was climate, because they see this as a global problem. Without the two biggest emitters on the planet actually working together, the rest of the planet doesn't come along.
Okay. And I mean, there is much discussion about the problem that we create for ourselves when we allow China to become, to control so much of the industry and the minerals around the transition. Is that a problem for the rest of the world, do you think?
Well, this is where the geopolitics and the economics collide, right? In the economic model of trying to get to climate solutions, you'd want the cheapest solutions to win out, doesn't matter who produces them. And China currently does make the cheapest of all clean technologies. And if you just allow for only Chinese solar panels and wind turbines and batteries to power the clean energy future, we are likely to pay a lower price to get to net zero. But of course, that's where the geopolitics collides, because that means taking away jobs from places like the US or Europe, where they need to move away from the dirty industries to the clean industries. And so you're going to have to make difficult choices where it may not be the most economically efficient way to get to net zero, but it would be the most politically expedient way to get to net zero, while you have to pay a higher cost because you're going to bring that manufacturing back to your shore. And some of that is starting to happen in the US with this Inflation Reduction Act money. Same thing's trying to be done by India, but also by Europe to try and get more solar manufacturing in within those borders, or getting more battery manufacturing or recycling in those borders. So it's going to be a messy transition. I think that's a given. So you see these paths of net zero going from where we are at 40 billion tons of emissions to zero. They look smooth. They're going to be nothing like it.
And do you worry? I want to get onto the exciting stories in your book in a minute, but before that, I want to ask you the extent to which you worry, because I know you watch this kind of thing all the time, much more than I do, about the backlash against net zero that we've seen a bit of in the UK, we've seen a bit of in other countries, and we've seen particularly in the US, a major backlash against ESG, against investing with environmental, social governance factors, and particular environmental factors at the top, on the basis that it doesn't appear to outperform, etc. So we've seen that conversation around that. Do you feel a backlash against the transition that may impact the transition?
Yes, and that backlash is very real, and it's playing out in multiple countries around the world right now. It's not the only story. There are other places like in Brazil or in Australia where climate elections have driven governments to do more. You might see that here in the UK later this year when the election happens and maybe the Conservatives are booted out and Labour is brought in. But yes, that backlash is real. And the reality is, perhaps if we were to find one answer, is that governments have not been good at communicating to people what they have signed up to with net zero, that what kind of transformation it's going to involve for people's everyday lives, what are the costs that people will have to bear upfront, because many of these technologies are expensive upfront, even if they're long run, they're cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives now. And that these things will have to be done in a consistent manner over decades, that you can't just go, this year we are not focused on net zero, next year we are focused on net zero. These policies just have to stick around for much longer for them to actually pay off. And that communication hasn't happened. That reality check hasn't come from politicians. And I think that may be perhaps the biggest reason to blame the backlash.
Well, I suppose one of the things, isn't it, is that, governments consistently tell people that the transition will mean cheaper energy for them, but they never add the words on the end, in the very long term. Whereas, in fact, short term, that's not true.
Correct. Yes. And I think that conversation needs to happen. And I think the backlash is going to focus the minds of the politicians who understand the climate challenge to get to this communication. But there's the second thing I worry about, which as a climate journalist, I have to worry about, which is the unknown impacts that come from the unknowns of climate science. There are tipping points and acceleration in the climate impacts that we really don't understand. For example, the record temperatures we are experiencing over the past year around the world are not being explained by climate models. And that is really alarming, because climate models have become better and better. Our ability to understand where we are headed has become better and better. But if climate change and global warming is outrunning those models, then those impacts may come sooner. And that can cause all kinds of real world problems, right? You might get more migration because countries become destabilized. You might get agricultural production falling in places you don't want it to fall. And that could cause problems for net zero, because imagine if you have 10 times as many people wanting to get into America from the southern border, what the politics could look like.
Well, we know about models, don't we? Very rarely correct, but you never know which direction they're going to be wrong in. Okay, let's move into the positive bit. Let's talk about some of the fantastic examples of progress you write about in the book. And one of the things that I found, I found all the chapters interesting, and we might go on to the reformer later. I really liked that. But let's talk about India and solar and the entrepreneurialism around that.
So India is a low middle income country. I grew up there. It's a very price sensitive market. If it's not cheap, it is not scaling. And so in India, it came to the renewables party late, but when it showed up, it really showed up. And so the story that I chart is between 2010 and 2020 of India starting to realize that solar is going to become the cheapest source of energy and that it has a ton of potential. So governments brought in some of the policies that we've seen in the West, where you have people being paid for producing solar, so-called feed-in tariff. But India is also a very difficult place to do business. There is corruption, bureaucracy, government entities that have to pay for solar production are delayed in their payments. And so I feature the story of Sumant Sinha, who's the head of Renew, which is one of the largest renewable energy companies in India right now, and how he went about finding his ways around the bureaucracy to make solar deployment work at scale. And these are sometimes very small, silly things like having a team that would go and harangue the government officials to make sure the payments are coming in. Or they're more systemic things where companies are informing governments on what kind of policy is needed so that companies can deploy solar and make the price of electricity cheaper for everybody. And these are not things that typically happen in the Indian market often enough. And now that it's happened, and through what Renew was able to do, it's really opened up the market. Solar story in India has just been one of the most interesting stories to watch as a technology story, but also as a business story over the past decade.
And can that model be extended to other countries? Would it work elsewhere?
That was the hope, that I wanted to see if there are lessons that you can draw from India and see if within that political economic context that is India, those lessons could be applied to Nigeria, to Kenya, to South Africa, places which are rich in solar but are developing countries. And some of that is starting to play out. So in Nigeria, for example, which is an astonishing place, given, Lagos has about 1 gigawatt of power production. Same size city, which is Shanghai, has 30 gigawatts of power production. And so you have this enormous population that wants electricity but doesn't have it. And what's happened over the past year is that diesel subsidies have been taken off. And so suddenly there's a solar boom in Nigeria. And many of the lessons learned from what's happening in India, where you bring in some of the foreign capital, but you also bring in reform on the electricity markets, are being applied now in Nigeria. And we'll see over the next few years, the rate of growth of solar has been astonishing over the past year, and it's likely to continue.
Fascinating. Now, I want to talk about one of the other chapters in the book about batteries, because none of this works. None of this works unless we can really find a way to store large amounts of energy over significant amounts of time, right? This is the big problem with intermittency is if we can't store it, then we always have to have backup systems. But here you've seen significant progress as well, right?
Yes. So the battery chapter focuses on CATL, which is now the world's largest lithium-ion battery company in the world. And it is an astonishing story given CATL was only formed in 2011. And the story comes from a little bit of background in how China developed. And perhaps the story actually starts a decade before that. So in its previous form, there was a company called ATL that was created in 1999. And China was just about to join the WTO. It was starting to become the factory of the world. And the founders of ATL wanted to make batteries for the gadgets that we were enjoying at that time. I don't think podcasts had been invented, but you had those little Walkman that we used for listening to music. And they were supplying those batteries to those devices, eventually to Samsung and Apple when they started making smartphones. But as soon as they got into manufacturing lithium-ion batteries, they started getting incoming from electric car companies. Unusually, the earliest one they got was from an Indian electric car company called Reva, which was running electric cars, these two-seater cars, on lead-acid batteries and wanted to use lithium-ion batteries instead. And the founders realized that there's actually an opportunity in moving to cars where you're going to need 1,000 times the size of a battery we are putting in a gadget. And it seems there are policies being put in place both in China but in other countries to move to electrification. And so they created CATL. And unlike what other Chinese manufacturers have been blamed for, this wasn't about stealing technology or just making copycats of things that were being made elsewhere in the world. They actually went out and bought licenses for the technology early on, but also created a research department to bring in technology innovation within CATL. And that started to show up. Very soon they landed contracts with foreign car manufacturers. BMW was one of the earliest ones. And now it has huge contracts with pretty much every car maker. And so much so that its technology development now is becoming the source of jealousy for many of the large battery makers that existed before CATL came around, the Japanese ones, the South Korean ones, and even American battery makers.
Do you think, talking about batteries, one of the things that we talked about earlier was problems with the grid and the difficulties of delivering power and the difficulties of interconnectors, etc. And of course, I've been writing recently about the NIMBYs not in my backyard when it comes to the grid. Nobody wants a great big pylon in their back garden, and they have massive impact on house prices, etc. And so we've been looking at small modular reactors and looking at how nuclear can solve that problem by bringing the power to where it's needed rather than the power having to be transmitted long distances. I mean, you haven't written about this in the book at length, but is nuclear a big part of the answer here? Maybe a better part of the answer?
Well, I wanted to write a chapter on nuclear. The only country that is scaling nuclear in the era of climate action is China. And I got no access to China's nuclear fleet. That is one place where, as a reporter, you can't go. And so all these other ideas on small modular nuclear reactors, or even a renaissance in trying to build large nuclear reactors, is currently a dream. And the costs of actually building nuclear are so high that if you're going to try and do that as a clean energy alternative with solar and batteries combined, you're not able to compete. So if you look at net zero projections, for example, from Bloomberg NEF, they see nuclear contributing 1% of electricity in the 2050 net zero mix, which is 19% lower than the electricity that nuclear provides today to the global grid.
Pretty depressing, isn't it? How can an individual invest in the transition, take advantage of some of the exciting trends here?
The easiest way you could have done it maybe 2 years ago was to move to responsible investing, to ESG investing, which is these options now are available in your pension pots, in the places you can put money in. But that's getting muddled because of two things. One, there's the political backlash that you're seeing from certain parts on ESG. And then there is also just the muddling of ESG itself, which is the metrics that it counts and whether it's investing in the right places or making false promises to the investor that that money is going towards the transition. So right now, it's actually not a good time to think about how as an individual you can invest in the transition. And it's a problem that investors need to solve if they want the amount of capital that needs to come through in the energy transition.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today. And listeners, Climate Capitalism, Winning the Global Race to Zero Emissions. Highly recommended, not least, by the way, by Bill Gates, who says on the front, an important read for anyone in need of optimism. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right, John. I know that you and I both feel conflicted about a lot of the policy around climate change because we tend to think, well, you're making it worse here, you're making it better, are you affecting living standards in the way that you intended to? Are you making energy too expensive? Is this even possible? We worry, don't we? We worry about some of the directions that have been taken in policy terms. But did listening to this conversation make you feel more reassured?
If I'm honest, yes. And the thing that stood out to me is, I guess, what we were talking about in the introduction, it's like Akshat makes the really important point, and the one that we are always making about why markets and capitalism are a good system, is that it's all about signalling. And so, so his point is that the capitalist system is the best one to rely on because it's the one that tells you, it best sorts the places in which to put your resources. And again, the whole point about this, and I think the other thing that concerns us a lot of the time when you talk about this, is that capitalism is the only system for making the trade-offs. Yep. Whereas an awful lot of the time when people talk about this, they act as if there aren't any trade-offs. They act as if, we could just do degrowth, without mentioning that would mean about 6 billion people would die anyway because, capitalism's the only thing that has made, the current global population sustainable, etc., etc.
Yeah, and they talk about transforming agriculture such that it produces zero emissions without pointing out that would also mean many millions of people would starve to death, which can't be a bad thing.
Yes.
Great scheme.
Exactly. Yeah. Degrowth is basically a death cult, whether people recognise it or not. Whereas this is good. This is a kind of healthy way of looking at, so how do we actually deal with the fact that we need to stop pumping as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So let's do something sensible about it rather than saying we're all just going to go back to the Stone Age.
And he recognises the difficulty of the timeframes that we put in place and the absurdity of saying we will meet net zero by a particular date when we have no idea whether we will be able to come up with the technologies to allow that to happen, as we say, without going degrowth and death. And so all those contradictions are recognized in this conversation, which is quite refreshing. We also talk about the problem of intermittency and the ridiculous idea that you can have renewables without backup and without batteries. It just can't work. We talk about that, which is very interesting, I think, because often you discuss these things with people and you don't hear these really important restrictions on the speed at which we can move.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff in there as well. I mean, the idea of countries with ample sunshine, etc. Kind of being able to leapfrog certain parts of the electricity system, and just rely on solar. One thing I would actually like explained to me in much more detail. I'm being honest here, and I know that some of our listeners are engineers and things like that, but I don't get why everyone who talks about this is still so resolutely opposed to nuclear. I know it's expensive, but why is it expensive? Why is it less expensive and more expensive and more infrastructure heavy than having to stick a whole load of cables between different countries in the world? Because, I don't know, Saudi produces lots of sun and we need it in the UK. Do you know what I mean? I'm sort of thinking...
When we talked about this before, the answer is always regulation. In that the regulation around nuclear is so intense, so difficult, and we will not relax it in any way at all, despite, you remember our conversation with Catherine Porter back a few months ago when we talked about this and about how the incidence of nuclear accidents is incredibly low, and the incidence of death as a result of those nuclear accidents is also incredibly low, lower than in all other parts of the energy industry. But nonetheless, we cannot find it within us somehow to make it easier to build. But I mean, there is change coming here because, our big bad billionaires in the US, and we talked about this the other day when we were talking about AI and the extraordinary amount of energy that AI requires. Someone asked me the other day, which I thought was fascinating, said to me, has anyone done the sums on NVIDIA and the forecast sales of chips? If all those chips were used, how much energy would be required? Well, just an insane amount, more than we have. This is nuts. So we must have nuclear, and we can already see in the US that the big billionaires are going there. Look at Bill Gates and his activity there, for example. You can see that this is a solution that bad capitalists or possibly good capitalists are looking at very carefully. But from a public point of view, it's all about, I think, as I understand it, regulation. But on the face of it, if an alien came down today and looked at what we were doing and well, hang on a sec, you don't need 200,000 acres for solar. You could just have 3 acres for nuclear, and the interconnectors would be so much easier because the nuclear plant can go where electricity is required rather than somewhere else. We have our wind turbines, we have them way, way, way offshore, and the interconnectors we have to create for that to get them back to where we use the energy. This is massive, where you can just put a little small modular reactor right next to the town. So I don't know. I'm with you on this. I'm very confused by it, and it's something that Akshat and I didn't talk about. And I can only assume that governments have these conversations at high levels when they talk about infrastructure spend and how we simply can't afford that infrastructure spend. Obviously, in the UK, we clearly can't afford to do what we need to do to revamp the grid in such a way as to use solar and wind in the way that we're talking about. I've rambled.
No, that's all right.
Sorry, John.
It's that kind of topic.
Yeah, you speak. Otherwise, we'll get more of those emails that say, Merryn, let him speak.
Well, no, I was literally just sorry. I'm rambling in my head because I was thinking everyone says, right, so if you can plug in your electric cars and then run the grid off the battery, why can't we plug the nuclear submarines in overnight and run the country off of their batteries?
Okay, this is exactly the kind of time when our producer Summer is going to interrupt and say, Merryn, don't let him speak. Don't let him speak.
Bring this to an end. Stop the idiot from talking.
I think I'm bringing this to an end. If anyone knows the answer to John's question, why we can't just plug the electricity grid into the submarines, let us know. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you like our show, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Additional editing by Blake Maple. Special thanks to Akshat Rathi and to John Stepek. And actually, seriously, the more I think about it, why can't we have submarines offshore all around the UK and the grid plugged into them? Answers to the usual email. Thank you.